Everyone, please join me in welcoming my friend, delight and brilliant speaker, Aaron Aldrich. For his charity, he's chosen open sourcing mental illness. Again, there'll be links for all of these in the Discord. And one of the questions I asked, I'm so glad Aaron chose to answer this, is who would play you in a movie? And he chose Haley Joel Osment, which I agree with, surprisingly. And I'm just thrilled that you chose that one to answer. And today he's going to talk to us about sticking together while staying apart, resilience in the time of global pandemic. Aaron, please take it away.
All right. Hey, everybody. I think I've figured out how to switch and do slides at the same time. And I just need to point out something real quick, because I wonder if it'll actually change on the screen too. So Haley Joel Osment and then me. And I just need to point that out for everybody real quick, just so you know. All right. Okay. So so let's start. I'm super thrilled to be a part of this amazing hybrid of Animal Crossing and DevOps conference. It's a bit meta in that I'm going to talk about how these things are really good for us to be doing right now while we're actively doing this thing that's really good for us right now. And we're going to do it all in the context of resilience, and it'll be great. So let's start, because I clicked the screen and it moved to the next slide. So perfect. So I want to start with this idea. Everything's a little bit broken all of the time, but it keeps working anyway, which I think is just a fundamental truth of the universe. There's always stuff that's not working, but we keep moving on. Or I think, to put it another way, as the great Sir Terry Pratchett had put it, 1,000,000 to 1 chances crop up 9 times out of 10. So what are we talking about here? So let's dive through resilience. There's a little bit of level setting we're going to have to do, and it's going to be a blast. So hold on. So there's always some definitions we have to talk about. Whenever we talk about resilience, you're going to end up talking about 4 things. There's going to be rebound, robustness, graceful extensibility, and sustained adaptability. These are the 4 corners of resilience that we're going to define real quick, so we're all on the same page. So rebound, right? This is getting back to normal. How quickly can you get back to a normal state after a surprise or incident? The interesting thing here is that people who are really good at rebound and groups that are really good at rebound, all that work happens ahead of time. It's not like you can't study the rebound action itself. It's all about preparatory work. It's all about building the feature flags, or all about building your CI/CD pipelines really well. Robustness is kind of what you think about, right? This is withstanding well-modeled disturbances, right? Like this is the fence in the wall that you know what it's going to withstand and what it's not. It's about known knowns, right? You build houses in the tropics out of concrete with no windows because they're going to have to deal with a hurricane. Graceful extensibility. This is sort of how you extend your operational boundaries, right? When Netflix has record numbers of people streaming due to some reason, we're all stuck indoors. It doesn't just fall over. Like, maybe your streaming quality drops and it keeps going. You sort of extended the boundary of failure past the end of it. And then sustained adaptability. This is usually where software can't hang, and where we're talking about the realm of living organisms. We're talking about recognizing and managing adaptive capabilities. It's about long time scales, and you're really talking about overlapping networks that are coming into play here. So that's a lot of academic data that I'm trying to throw at you all at once. I'm going to throw one more example real quick, and we're going to talk about bone very briefly. So the concept here, bone has been given as the archetype of resilience by Dr. Richard Cook, who's way in the field of resilience engineering. Very, very amazing person. It's continuously being created and destroyed. It's all being directed by mechanical strain. It's not like some major plan, and all those signals are happening at the cell level. It's not like this brain process that's redirecting your bone. It's all happening at low levels here. He gets a lot more into this. This is literally a whole talk about bone, and you should go watch it from Redeploy last year. I want to take away a couple more points, and the main thing is that resilience engineering in regards to bone is something we've been doing for 3,500 years, right? The bone is naturally resilient, and it'll when you break a bone, it'll regrow on its own. But we found out that if you set the bone right, if you create the best possible conditions for it to be resilient, it'll do a lot better. We can actually manipulate those conditions in order for its natural resilience to do the best, right? In order for it to be the most resilient it can be. He also talks about this new realm of resilience engineering where we start messing with the actual resilient capabilities of bone itself, but I'm not much going to touch on that. You should watch the talk for that because it's going to be a little bit more than I can fit in here. All right, so our computer systems. These are what they look like now, in case you're unfamiliar with microservice architecture. Actually, this is what Netflix looks like. This is the classic slide that when someone from Netflix presents and they say, everyone wants to know what our architecture looks like. Here you go, here's a diagram. So the gist here that I want you to take out of it is it's super complicated. There's lots of different systems that are all communicating in different levels. They're not just all talking to some centralized controller. They're all communicating with each other. They're sending signals back and forth, lots of overlapping systems, overlapping networks, that sort of thing going on here. And a lot of our systems that we build exemplify on their own these aspects of resilience, right? They can rebound from a failure. When something goes wrong, they can get back to normal. We've got lots of well-modeled disturbances in our system that we know are going to happen, right? Like what happens when the node goes down? Well, we have high availability. Like we know how to handle that. These are the known knowns that we're dealing with. And we know, when we get to the end of the operational boundaries, how to fix it. But you'll notice here, the system itself doesn't contain any adaptability on its own, right? And that's because all of that comes from the edge that's not actually shown in that picture, right? Beyond the edges of that diagram are all of the people involved in that system, right? There's a whole bunch of engineers that are building the system, and there's a whole bunch of us on the other side consuming that system as well. So that's why we talk about socio-technical systems so much, because you can't really separate the humans from the technical systems when you really get down to dealing with the resilience of them and how they're built and how they're operated. So Conway's law says that we design systems that represent an organization's communication structure, and I think we can kind of interpret the opposite of that as well, right? So as we're building these microservice architectures, these loosely coupled networks that have, highly communicative at low levels, and are kind of self-healing, like our organization starts to resemble that. That's when we start talking about service teams rather than owning the whole product end to end, right? They're dealing with one small section of it so they can move quickly and iterate quickly and absorb change. Okay, so let's take a moment. So we've got all of this in mind, and I want to go through a little bit of a thought exercise as we go through here. So in fact, what you can do is, we're probably all sitting at computers. I assume there's no one like driving and consuming this because it's not a podcast. But if you are, like, don't close your eyes. But everyone else could close their eyes if it helps visualization. I want you to think back in time to, we're all some level of DevOps here. So think back in time to some organizational incident that you had, probably the worst one, because that's probably what's going to come to mind right away, that one that sticks out in your head. And if you think back to that incident, think about what happened, think about the moment you realized it was an incident. What notified you of that? Was there a system that said, we have a problem here? Or even if there wasn't there still a person that had to go investigate it and say, yeah, this is not normal? Or was it automatically detected? Was there some magic that happened there? Think a moment too of how surprising was this incident? Was this something you planned for and were able to quickly resolve? Was this something that you had no idea what was going to happen? And this took a lot of scrambling. It came out of left field. And then by the time you get to the end of that incident, I'm curious also, where I assume it got resolved. If it didn't, maybe the whole company collapsed and like Night Capital is a whole lesson for all of us, but that's a whole different story. But if it did get resolved, where did that resolution come from? Right? Was there something that came from the top down? Was it something that came from an engineer working on it, someone who had been deeply involved with that system all the time? Just kind of think about where these different things come from. And you can even think, if you want to zoom out a bit, think about all the overlapping networks of people that were involved, from an on-call engineer to the team that responded to it, to maybe you had to call in PR, customers might have been affected, maybe food delivery services had to get called and relied upon during this time as well. So just kind of keep all these things in mind as we go through. But the main thing is thinking about that solution as we move here. Because the part I want to point out about that solution and where it comes from are these concepts of sharp end and blunt end. Sharp end is when we talk about it in this context, is the end closest to the work, the actual practitioners that are doing work. And the blunt end are removed from the experiments. These are all the upstream decision makers. And I'm going to guess, probably with a 90% certainty, that anyone going through this exercise legitimately, the solutions came from the sharp end of the system, right? There wasn't like a policy that got passed down through your organization that solved the incident. It was probably a solution that an engineer came up with that fixed the problem you were having. So those are the sharpen exhibit some interesting characteristics that should sound a little bit familiar for us here. They're constantly building and destroying systems. They have really strong signaling because they talk amongst each other all the time. They tend to improve the systems based on the strain those systems are receiving. And in fact, will do so naturally given ownership. Like if we actually give folks ownership of their services and ownership of the systems they work on, they will naturally improve the resilience of those systems. This is done through the Woolworths experiment proves a lot of that, but you'll have to read it after. So J. Paul Reed is going to get quoted twice here, but at Failover Conf, he brought this up. He said, the teams that do well dealing with impact, surprises, and incidents are those that have a strong common ground. And that makes sense to me, because then if we want to improve the team's resilience, we want to improve their ability to deal with surprises, we should build a strong common ground. That's what I said just now. And it makes a lot of sense, right? Like, so if they have, we should improve the thing that indicates that the teams work better. So what is a common ground? We're going to go through again quickly. Common ground for a team means you have a basic compact. You know when you're a part of the team, you know when you're working on that team. Most importantly, you know when you're not. Like if you need to step out to go take care of family, that's an important thing to communicate to your team so they know you're not available. You have goal alignment and commitment. That's what it says on the tin. You have interpredictability. That's you kind of get an understanding of how each other are going to behave in certain circumstances. It's sort of the norms of behavior. And if you have a strong common ground, you can start to sustain and repair itself as well. You want to naturally continue to build that common ground amongst teammates. So this is interesting. So if you think about it, what are all these activities we do that can build common ground? What helps us work together as a team and grow that structure closer together? Part of it is blameless postmortems. I know Maddie talked about it earlier about that. And the main goal here is because we want to get beyond finding a scapegoat. We don't want to just say, oh, dear executive, we found out this was the cause of the problem. It'll never happen again. Thank you very much. That's the idea of like root cause analysis. But when we get to blameless postmortems, we want to understand what's beyond that, not just this is the straw that broke the camel's back isn't interesting, but why were all the other straws there? Was the camel's back strong enough in the first place? Who put this saddle on and why was it rushed? Were there other pressures put on that system that required us to take shortcuts to get to this point? That's where the interesting learning comes from. So learning is the goal here, not just finding a scapegoat and saying it'll never happen again. Chaos engineering, this concept is really big right now. That's also going to help you build common ground because it's going to start to introduce surprises into your system. Game days can be a part of that as well, where again, you're learning not just how your system interacts, but how do the people interact on your team when things go wrong. And I think absolutely that modeling vulnerability that comes from that as well. When you can start showing that as leadership and you can start showing that amongst your team, you start building closer bonds and you start increasing that ability to work together. Right. We're talking about high performing teams. So we obviously have to look at the top 5 characteristics that Google discovered during their studies. And of course, psychological safety at number 1. This is, I agree, super duper important for your teams to function well. And that's why I just keep referencing this. It was super useful. Matt, thank you for giving the entire talk for me about psychological safety so I can hand wave through it and get the rest of my talk done. But yeah, if you want to talk about repairing teams and how to deal with that and how to maintain the common ground on your team, and you didn't see Matt's talk, just go back and watch it. So this was a great quote when it talks about resilience. Resilience is about creating the conditions that maximize everyone's potential. And Rain said this in the Greater Than Code podcast, I think a few episodes ago, which is absolutely spot on. So here was a theory that I had not too long ago about how systems fail and how resilient systems support each other. And want to tell you where I came with this. So my initial thought was all these overlapping networks sort of support each other at different bigger and hierarchical levels, right? Networks of networks of networks that get bigger. And so my initial thought was kind of thinking of incident modeling. And you see, like if this small computer system sort of breaks and fails, that sort of fails back a level into the human network. And if that one on-call engineer doesn't work, it fails back to the team and so on and so forth until like the company can get involved and like fix a problem. So it was always up a hierarchical level. And then sort of something happened recently where I had to think about how the reverse of this model functions. You may or may not be aware, you probably are aware, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And so what I'm seeing is what happens when the larger systems fail, because that's what seems to be happening now. And yet we're still here, right? Like we're still functioning. And so the fact that they're supported by larger networks can't be true. They have to be overlapping small cellular networks that are holding the whole thing up. That even if this concept of the large governmental network is not providing the answers we need, it's these smaller groups that can still maintain the resilience in this moment, right? So we have to ask ourselves, what happens when governments fail, right? What happens when the really big systems that hold us up aren't doing that anymore? Well, that's it. It's left to us, right? No one else is going to come in and help us. And so this is the conclusion I've come to, is that all this work that we do building community building is resilience engineering, right? That is the goal. It's why we care so much about it, and why there's a whole group that cares about community deeply. When you talk about developer relations, you talk about community, we're always thinking about that because we want to build resilient communities that can continue on beyond the world of a technology or beyond the concept of a company. We want to build these communities that are self-sustaining and self-growing. And you think about it, what do we think about the characteristics of a strong community? Right? Usually they're diverse. We've got lots of different skill sets, lots of different places that knowledge actually comes from. Lots of different perspectives even, right? Like, I don't know how many times I've been planning something and had someone who just has a different background than me informs me like, hey, you're excluding a bunch of these people. And I was like, oh crap, you're right. I totally missed that. And they're like, that's cool. That makes sense that you missed that because you don't have the experience that I have. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I'm glad we have you on this team. They have high trust and safety, right? Really strong communities you can be yourself in, right? You don't have to perform as much. I mean, I think we all use masks and some performance to an extent for our own personal safety psychologically, but when you have really strong communities, you can use them less often. You can be more of yourself and consequently contribute more to that community. Really strong communities always want to sustain and repair themselves, right? This is why we have things like codes of conduct and why we have uh, processes like nonviolent communication, because the goal is always to restore community whenever something goes wrong. We want to make sure that the community itself maintains a safe place, a place where you can be trusted. There's unpredictability, right? We get to know each other. Like, how often do you finally get to know a group of your friends? You're like, that is so Maddie the way that happened. Oh, that's definitely something Katie would do. Oh yeah, Aaron would totally say that, right? Because we start to learn who each other are when you have a tight community. We understand how each other operate better. And even these communities are made up of more loosely coupled layered networks, right? Like, I also exist in my family community, and I exist in like my town, and I exist also in the DevOps community, and also in my local, there's all these different networks that overlap and intermix. So it's kind of interesting if we actually look at what's happened in the government. This is actually my school district where I live in. Is what I think is so funny. We've got like 700 some people on a stream, and here I am in my little 6,000 person town in a basement, but also I'm in Animal Crossing. Anyway, sorry, I had to get existential for a moment. But yeah, what happened here, this is, while the school district is a bit of a government organization, like there were people that had to decide that we needed to deliver free meals to students. So everyone under 18 right now in our school district is getting meals delivered every day for breakfast and lunch, which is phenomenal because the area that I live in, it's absolutely necessary for a number of families. But look at this further, right? We've got stores that are offering shopping time specifically for vulnerable customers, and like no government made them do that. Like, yeah, it's sure nice for those companies to make that decision, and it definitely came down as a policy, and they definitely get some publicity out of it, but it doesn't make it not the right thing to do, right? They did the right thing for the community and their customer base that's there. And it gets even more direct. Direct locals in upstate South Carolina are sewing face masks for healthcare workers because when they're not available, we have to make them available. It became the job of the local people to support it. Or rent strikes. The government is not suspending rents. They are not suspending mortgages. And so when your community, when your neighbors can't afford to live, it is up to that community to make it possible for them to, right? To take collective action and make it possible that the least of us in this community can still be a part of it. yeah, a lot of this came out. A lot of this thought process came from this podcast. You should absolutely listen to it. It started out as the worst year ever, which was supposed to cover this horrible election cycle. Remember, we have an election cycle going on, and all the absolute like chaos that is and was. And very quickly has turned into so much more. There's a lot more of Worst Year Ever, but if you listen to one episode, listen to this one, because it talks about what you can specifically do in your communities, how you can help reach out and into your community, and how you can help connect people and support each other when government policy doesn't. So a lot of that's hard to do. And then someone set this tweet out online and reminded me of why it's hard to do. And I was like, oh yeah, I should be gentle with myself. And another one of my friends, used this very apt, um, what are words, metaphor of the empty cup, which I think is great because it comes up all the time and it's so perfectly apt, right? You can't pour from an empty cup. And if you're not taking care of yourself, if you're not making sure you are resilient and you're not operating properly, you really cannot pour into the community and further. It just keeps going, right? It's hard if the cup is cracked and leaking, and there is a ton to that as well. I actually thought about this for a while, again after Failover Conf, and thinking in the terms of resilience. And the concept here is we're all dealing with like cognitive load, and the toss away like observation that J. Paul Reed made was all of us are probably sacrificing thoroughness right now, which is a way that we deal with overload in the cognitive space. And I'm like, oh, the real takeaway here is all of us are overloaded right now. We are all dealing with maximum cognitive load all of the time. And what we tend to do, one of the ways we deal with that is we borrow time, we borrow energy. Normally it's like work life and home life is separate. So like when you're work, maybe you borrow energy from another project, maybe you borrow resources from another team, maybe you're negotiate the deadlines, or your work isn't as complete as it could be. But now that we've suddenly had this mixing of home and work life, we've just sort of collided all at once, that I don't leave my house, right? I'm working from my basement, and then I go upstairs when I go home, right? And what I end up doing is I borrow from my home time to get my work time done because I'm not as productive. And that's not a healthy or maintainable structure. That is not a resilient way, right? It's resilient in that it allows me to accomplish more than I would otherwise, but it is also damaging the part of me that is resilient inside of these networks as well. So I had a whole blog post that I wrote up about that. That's sort of this in a nutshell. But things we can also do, like we need these moments of joy in our lives, right? These are self-sustaining. They're sustaining our communities while we're gone. They're sustaining ourselves here. Like this great moment in a Zoom chat when three of the organizers from Portland DevOps Days all got their Portland DevOps Days shirts and their black jackets and took pictures of themselves in Zoom and set them as each other's background, which was just hilarious and fun and connecting right in that moment, right? It's a little bit like being close together again. There's more Matt Stratton talks about zebras and fight, flight, or freeze, and the concept there that our brains experience trauma and the memory of trauma in a very similar way, because as smart as we are, we're kind of dumb. But so is true of those good memories, right? We experience the joy of that moment and the memory of that moment very similarly. They bring back those same feelings. Like Animal Crossing has done this amazing thing, and I don't know what it is, but like something about our avatars being present in virtual meet space. I don't know what to call it. Like we're both here, even though we're in virtual space, but we're together. And like that little corner of togetherness has made it that much more meaningful. And like this is why the whole world is playing Animal Crossing right now. We get to build our little ideal communities and visit each other on islands and pretend like in some corner of our life it's a little bit normal. This conference is perfect, right? It's this hilarious, like Animal Crossing conference that's happening, and it's wonderful in bringing us all together. It is just the right amount of silliness and seriousness that we need. And I think Katie's going to talk a lot more about your own self-resilience and building up yourself a little bit more. So like I can just hand wave off that and transition here too. So stay tuned if you're interested in this stuff. Don't walk away yet. There's more talk. But here's what I want to get at. as far as teams are concerned, you need to enable everyone's potential and then get out of the way, right? Anything that's not enabling them to be everything they can is hindering the resilience and hindering your team. Cool. So that's me. That's my talk. I'm Aaron Aldrich. I'm a developer advocate for Launch Darkly. My license plate literally says DevOps. That used to be Matt Stratton's joke, and then I stole it because he lost the license plate. You can find these slides at speaking.crazy.com. They are all up there. I checked, as well as the resources for all this. More stuff at osmehelp.org. I do emotional intelligence work and like nonviolent communications things with Emotional API. Check that out. I organize what used to be just DevOps Days Hartford, and now it's like 5 of them that I'm involved in. So check out DevOps Days. They're good conferences. Thanks. I love you. Be safe out there. We're all in this together.
Aaron, that was really lovely. And people in the chat are very moved. So thank you for helping us be better selves and be more aware. Yeah, I will. So we'll do one sort of technical question, which is just
Okay.
there's been a little bit of discussion here, but how do you feel about the difference between the phrases postmortem and retrospective?
It is a battle I've decided I'm not winning anytime soon. Like, so for a while I was very much about like we shouldn't call it a postmortem because of all the negative connotations that are along with it. But I also realized that this nomenclature and this terminology is also super familiar and it's easy to latch on and understand what it is.
Sure.
So I think recognizing that is a big aspect of it. If you are in a place where you get to choose the name of it, like please like call it a retrospective. That's so much better. But I think it's one of those, like, I'm fighting the norm of the industry and I'm giving up on that battle. The same reason like DevOps is not a position, but also like go get your extra 40 grand.
Yeah, exactly. It's I feel like it's kind of the same as putting DevOps in air quotes, like we talked about with David earlier. It's definitely. And then there's that was really the only technical question. People were maybe they were surprised at how deep you were. What I wasn't, because I was prepared. And I really encourage everyone to check out Emotional API. I'm a big fan, and I find it to be really helpful and interesting and all of the above. So can everyone please just help me thank Aaron one more time? Warm, warm thank yous. What a delight.
Thank you.
Hooray.
Well, that means I have to go sit down now. Hang on.
Yeah, get on my podium.